Mohamed Gammoudi, the Tunisian middle and long-distance athlete of the 1960s and the 1970s, celebrates his 87th birthday later this month. A contemporary of Ron Clark, Steve Prefontaine, Mamo Wolde and Kip Keino, the four-time Olympic medalist in 3 consecutive Olympic Games, has been quietly relegated to the margins of athletics history. In this week's podcast, our 100th, we tell his story from growing up as one of 8 brothers on a grain farm in deep Tunisia to sharing the story behind his golden moment, winning gold in the men's 5,000 meters at the Mexico City Olympics in 1968. We also analyze why the neglect outside of the country of his birth has come to pass. This is the fascinating story of Africa's largely unknown outlier, Mohamed Gammoudi. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. Mohamed Gammoudi, the Tunisian middle and long-distance athlete of the 1960s and the 1970s, comes from a modest farming family of 8 brothers. 2 of Gammoudi's younger brothers, Ali and Hamida, were pretty handy athletes and cross-country runners too. Once, according to Mohamed's daughter, Nadia, who patiently answered my questions over several weeks via email, the 3 Gammoudi brothers all found their way onto the podium at a meeting in Belgium. Mohamed first, Hamida second, and Ali third, a Gammoudi clean sweep. Of the 8 Gammoudi brothers, Mohamed, although he was neither the youngest nor the oldest of the 8, was the most athletically gifted. His gifts emerged slowly, more or less coinciding with him volunteering for the Tunisian army when he was in his late teens. Once in the army, he was invited to race. This wasn't any old race. The winner received a carton of cigarettes and 2 weeks' leave. Gammoudi was homesick. He made sure that he won the race so that he could return to the family wheat, corn, and barley farm. Gammoudi and his 7 brothers were born in an area of Tunisia famous for its athletes, but the winning of the army race signaled something beyond mere genetic inheritance. It signaled something profound. His talent and ambition might now be able to find expression in a world beyond the hills of western central Tunisia. And he had a kick at the end of a race that would hold him in pretty good stead. He began to compete internationally. That ambition dovetailed neatly with Tunisia's independence from France in 1956, when Mohamed was 18. Independence brought with it an appetite for heroes. He was one such hero. Perhaps he was the definitive post-independence Tunisian hero. It is difficult to say with certainty. So began a career that saw him win 4 Olympic medals in 3 consecutive Olympics, attending 4 Olympics all told. Despite such achievements, his full story is little known and seldom told outside of the Arabic-speaking world. If it is told, the Tunisian is often cast in the role of extra or bit player to the more stellar achievements of others with bigger names, or those who hailed from larger countries capable of representing themselves in a favorable light. We will try to get to grips with the reasons for this neglect as we continue to tell his story. When Gammoudi arrived in Tokyo shortly before his first Olympics in 1964, he arrived without any great personal expectation as a sort of double unknown. Firstly, although he had competed internationally by that stage, in the Mediterranean Games of the previous year, for example, he was little known as an athlete. Secondly, the country from which he came, Tunisia, was little known by the rest of the world, the Japanese included. Tunisia, who, as a protectorate, had only gained independence 8 years previously, shortly after Morocco had gained hers, had neither an embassy nor a consulate in Tokyo. As a result, the Japanese didn't even know what the Tunisian flag looked like. Luckily, Gammoudi had a miniature version of the Tunisian flag on his kit bag and allowed it to be copied so that a proper Tunisian flag could be made and appear at the pre-Games march past. It was good that the Japanese organizers of the 1964 Olympics were conscientious enough to have a Tunisian flag to hand, because Gammoudi won a silver medal in the men's 10,000 meters, beating Ron Clark, the Australian then world record holder, into third place. Clark, with his slightly imperious running style, was leading the latter stages of the race with the Native American Billy Mills, when the Tunisian, who was lurking in third place just behind them, elbowed his way past both. With a surge of easy power, his head rocking gently on his shoulders in that distinctive way of his, Gammoudi seized the lead. Clark, who had missed the two previous Olympics, at Melbourne and in Rome, couldn't allow the Tunisian surge to go unanswered. He began to reel in Gammoudi's lead. Clark has a reputation to uphold. He was the world record holder over the distance. Many in the stands in Tokyo expected that, as the world record holder, his gold medal in the 10,000 meters was a mere formality. On the back straight, Clark caught Gammoudi. Running was perilous at this stage of the race, with back markers clogging the route. Gammoudi became aware of Clark's attentions and surged forward. Clark matched him, stride for stride, and so they dashed for the tape. So locked were Clark and Gammoudi in their duel that they were oblivious to the flying American athlete Mills, herring up on the outside. There was no stopping him. Mills overtook both of them and claimed the gold medal, with Gammoudi taking silver and Clark bronze. It was a medal that put paid to at least one career, because one of the American radio commentators became so overexcited in describing Mills' late surge that his employers deemed that he had sacrificed objectivity in favor of all too understandable hysteria. Such are the perils of commentating exciting races. Gammoudi and Mills had raced against one another in Amsterdam before Tokyo, so Mills wasn't completely an unknown quantity. After winning the race in the Netherlands, Gammoudi took Mills aside. He told him in no uncertain terms to work on his finish. Mills took the advice to heart. It was a determination to finish strongly and speed down the back straight that ironically accounted for Gammoudi and Clark in Tokyo. Gammoudi and Mills shared a variety of biographical similarities despite growing up thousands of kilometers apart. They were both from modest rural families, and both of their fathers died when they were comparatively young, Gammoudi's father passing when he was 8. Hardship was no stranger to either of them. Gammoudi was brought up by his hard-working and indefatigable mother, Thebe. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. The two athletes both encountered the military. Mills, after college, when he entered the Marines. Gammoudi volunteered as an infantryman after school. The military was to play an important supporting role in their developing careers, providing shelter, money, purpose, and the possibility to both of overseas travel. The military didn't only provide a supporting role in Gammoudi's case. In July 1961, the Tunisian authorities lost patience with the French over the naval air base in the port of Bizerte, which remained in French hands despite the fact that Tunisia had been independent for 5 years. The French had promised that the port would revert to the Tunisians post-independence, But this didn't happen, as the French continued to use it as a base from which to fight their rearguard action to hold onto Algeria. They even made private plans to lengthen the runway, which angered the Tunisians. Gammoudi's daughter, Nadia, tells the story of her father being asked by an officer if there was anyone present who wanted to volunteer to liberate Bizerte. Mohammed immediately raised his hand, but upon seeing this, the officer slapped him and said, You stay calm." Despite being told that he wasn't wanted, infantryman Gammoudi participated in the crisis anyway. Although the Tunisians were quickly repelled by French paratroopers and the skirmishes fizzled out after a couple of days, the French eventually honored their promise to withdraw. The port and naval airbase was finally returned to Tunisia just over 2 years later, in October 1963. Having claimed silver in the 10,000 meters in Tokyo without any great expectation of doing well, Gammoudi turned his attention to the 5,000 meters event. On the eve of the final in Tokyo, however, disaster. According to Nadia, Gammoudi realized shortly before the race that the blister he had on one of his feet was more serious than he thought and might prevent him from participating. The Tunisian team was small. They were traveling without a doctor. So the head of delegation took Gammoudi to a Romanian doctor who lifted the skin and drained the blister. The foot remained extremely painful, and as a result, Gammoudi couldn't walk, let alone run. After visiting the Romanian doctor, he borrowed a bicycle and cycled back to the Tunisian team's accommodation because it was easier to do so rather than walk. The injury prevented Gammoudi's participation in the 5,000-meter final, and the event was won by Bob Schull of the United States, followed by Harold Norpoth of the United Team of Germany, a man we will hear more of, with the US's Bill Dellinger in third. Although he didn't run in the 5,000 meters in Tokyo, Gammoudi returned to Tunis a hero. These were heady days for post-independence Tunisia. Unlike neighbors Algeria, Tunisia didn't suffer from a debilitating and bloody war of independence. These were days of hope and promise for the newly independent nation. Gammoudi was granted an audience with President Habib Bourguiba on his return from Japan. The two chatted pleasantly. Gammoudi was emboldened by his experience. He promised his president that when he participated in the Olympics next, he would bring the gold medal back to Tunisia. After silver in Tokyo, Gammoudi was well on the way to becoming a Tunisian household name, a process accelerated by the fact that Tunis was chosen as the venue for the 1967 Mediterranean Games. Unusually, the Tunis Games started with the 10,000 meters, Gammoudi's preferred event, rather than, say, the sprints. There was great expectation that the infantryman from the center of the country, a new Tunisian hero, would do well. He didn't disappoint. He won both the 5,000 meters and the 10,000 meters in Tunis, with the Mexico City Olympics now only a year away. Some of Gammoudi's altitude training for the Mexico City Olympics was done at Font-Romeu, the ski resort in the Pyrenees, so he wasn't entirely unprepared for the 1968 Games. As in Tokyo 4 years previously, the 10,000 meters in Mexico City, Gammoudi's preferred event, took place before the 5,000 meters. Gammoudi remembers the seconds at the start line well enough to remember that he quietly observed how the runners alongside were breathing. Quote, "I knew the calm ones from the agitated ones, and it helped me to manage my race," Gammoudi told me through his daughter. In the event, Naftali Temu of Kenya won the race, sprinting past Ethiopia's Momo Waldi with the finish tape in sight. Waldi attempted to respond, but the effort was too much for him and he was unable to catch Temu, but only just. In taking gold, Temu secured Kenya's first ever Olympic medal, a historic occasion in the shape of things to come. Gammoudi secured bronze, with Clark, who Gammoudi had passed in Tokyo 4 years before, in 6th position. The bronze medal was good for Gammoudi. It galvanized him ahead of the 5,000 meters, but it also relaxed him. In his own words, he became, quote, less apprehensive. Just before the race, he asked Temu and his Kenyan compatriot Kip Keino if they would consider, quote, collaborating in the race as Africans. They responded by asking him who he thought would be on the podium. He replied that, as far as he was concerned, it was down to 6. The two of them, the two Kenyans in other words, the two Ethiopian athletes, Ron Clark and himself. Quote, but they laughed at my reply and that upset me, Gammoudi said via his daughter in interview for this podcast. Gammoudi had promised his president that he would return from Mexico City with a gold medal, and time was now running out. Bronze in the 10,000 meters wasn't good enough, so now, with Kenyan laughter still ringing in his ears, here he was, and in his least preferred event, it was now or never. There were 3 athletes in the front of the field with a lap to go in the men's final of the 5,000 meters in the Mexico City Olympics of 1968. Mohamed Gammoudi of Tunisia was in the lead, followed by Naftali Temu and Kip Keino, both of Kenya. With approximately 200 meters to go, Gammoudi attempted to break Temu by increasing the pace down the back straight, building up a lead of 3 or 4 meters as he rounded the final bend. Temu was broken, but Gammoudi still had to deal with Keino, who began to sprint from about 80 meters out. Watching replays of the race, it isn't clear who is in front, so close are the Tunisian and the Kenyan. Just when it looks as if the Kenyan might be inching ahead, so Gammoudi matches him. Neither athlete gets tired or appears to tire. With 30 meters left to go, suddenly and almost inexplicably, Gammoudi finds a reserve of energy from some hidden depth. He sprints even faster, opening up a slight gap over Keino, who cannot respond. It is enough to give him the gold medal. He has kept his promise to his president, made at a reception given for him when he returned home from Tokyo 4 years before. It is Gammoudi's finest hour, a perfectly plotted race of bravery, speed, and cunning, and it has happened in his less preferred distance. How might it have unfolded if the Kenyans had been more amenable to entering into a collaboration at the start of the race? Given that his gold medal in Mexico appears from a distance to be the Tunisian's almost perfect race, it is interesting to hear him say that he was at his strongest 4 years later, in the 1972 Munich Olympics. He was already 34 by the time that Munich swung round. The Europeans and the British were frighteningly strong, and it must have been expected that Gammoudi would retire to his own olive farm on the edge of Tunis. Not so. The competitive fires still raged. He wanted to see if he had another medal in him. Perhaps he had 2. The cycle that characterized previous Olympics, with slight disappointment or injury in the 10,000 meters, leading to greater inspiration ahead of the 5,000 meters, continued in Munich. Undeterred that he was one of the oldest, if not the oldest, in the race, Gammoudi went out with high hopes in the 10,000-meter final. He had prepared well. During the race, however, disaster. Gammoudi tripped and fell, not completing the event. If the indignity of not finishing was bad, worse was to follow. Gammoudi felt unsupported by his delegation. He heard whispers that he was dried up. Quote, "The flame has died," he heard. That's it. His Mexico City gold for the president was his finest hour. Now he's all dried up. That night, Gammoudi went to bed with his running kit. He cried himself to sleep. He was adamant that this was it. He'd had enough. He wasn't going to compete in the 5,000 meters, which, anyway, wasn't his favorite race, so why even bother? But his wife, Saida, wouldn't hear of it. She told him he wouldn't see another Olympics. By 1976, he would be 38 after all, so he needed to get his head together and deal with the disappointment of falling in the 10,000 meters in Munich. Gammoudi vacillated. He hated hearing his delegation dismiss him. He hated feeling that this might be the slightly ignominious end to his Olympic career. Quote, "She's really the one who convinced me to participate," he told me. "If she wasn't with me, I wouldn't have run." Despite being convinced to race in the final by his wife, Gammoudi wasn't in a good space in the hours leading up to the final. That it was a stellar field didn't help. Many were talking about the charismatic American Steve Prefontaine. And let's not forget the Finn Lassie Viren or the gifted Belgian athlete Emile Puttemans. Threats too came from the British athletes Ian Stewart and David Bedford. Threats came from pretty much everywhere. On a bright, sunny afternoon, there was great expectation going into the race from those in the packed stadium too. Gammoudi acknowledged the fact, saying, "Contrary to the 5K of Mexico, Munich was full of stress and fear, and my big mistake was to have launched the finish very early." Prefontaine, Norpoth, the German who won silver in Tokyo as part of the combined German team, and Puttemans were the athletes that I was most wary of. Let's listen to the BBC commentary of the final from just under 4 laps out and note the almost uncanny prescience of the commentator and his description of Prefontaine.
The American in front, almost a cult in the United States. He's a sort of athletic beetle. There are T-shirts around, Go Pre, all around the stadium worn by American fans. The Europeans say that he hasn't really been in a war yet, but this boy's got utter belief in himself. And he's inexperienced enough in many ways not to know how good the others are. Prefontaine, another athlete who can't leave it late. A long-distance driver, really, who's got to go from home for way out. Ian Stewart in second place. Viren, who's a similar runner to Prefontaine, comes up and states his intention now. 3 laps to go. A curious run by Bedford, who's never believed to have had any sort of finish at all. Prefontaine leads, Viren second, Puttemans third. Ian Stewart, Great Britain fourth. The Olympic champion Gammoudi in 5th place. McCafferty, Scott.
With the lap to go, Gammoudi, who had been in 5th, began his surge, a long way out from which to do so. He was second at the bell behind Viren, with Prefontaine, in his slightly baggy dark blue shorts, tucking in on Gammoudi's shoulder in close attendance. So the three continued, galloping down the back straight. Further along, Prefontaine attacked, with Gammoudi responding, his burst of acceleration taking him into the lead from Prefontaine, with Viren still in close attendance. On the final bend, Viren shot forward, passing Gammoudi with apparent ease, Prefontaine being relegated to 3rd. With Viren striding to victory, the former Olympic champion managed to hold on to the silver, with a fast-closing Stewart pipping a devastated Prefontaine into 3rd. Let's listen to the commentary.
200 metres left. The champion Gammoudi leads. Viren moves up inside Prefontaine. The Finn and the American gathering for the final attack. And here comes Viren chasing his 2nd gold medal. Viren goes for home. Gammoudi is bankrupt. So too is Prefontaine. And the Finn goes in now for his 2nd gold medal, and Stewart with a late run. The Finn wins. Gammoudi second. Stewart gets the bronze. Prefontaine dies in the final stride.
Gammoudi was always an athlete with incredible stamina and longevity, so it comes as no surprise that he might well have competed in the following Olympics at Montreal in 1976. Unfortunately, however, Montreal was a contested Games. Many African athletes boycotted the 76 Olympics because they wanted the New Zealanders punished by the International Olympic Committee for daring to send a rugby side to South Africa that self-same year. It was not to be. The Africans, Tunisia included, boycotted the Games as they had threatened. The Munich Olympics were Gammoudi's last as a participant. Although he did actually arrive in Montreal, he never ran. It remains to try and unpick the reasons for why Gammoudi and his story is so neglected. Some say scandalously so. Was it because he was an outlier, coming from a newly independent African country many would struggle to find on a map? Was it because the African Revolution in athletics had yet to truly begin? Was it perhaps because he came from a small corner of the French and Arabic-speaking world whose stories seldom find their way across cultures and into English? All of these things are individually true, but together they add up to a greater truth, that Gammoudi, because of nationality, religion, size, and self-presentation, was an invisible man. People looked, but they didn't see. Maybe time will cure their myopia. My thanks for this podcast go, in particular, to Nadia Gammoudi, Mohammed's daughter, for her unfailing courtesy and patience, as well as to John Downs, the Irish cross-country champion and athletics activist, and to our very own Richard Meyer, a man who knows a good athletics story when he sees one. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.